Let me introduce the first panel, Current Trends and Seizing Opportunities. Dear friends, thank you very much for being here today with us. We have the privilege of hosting a US-oriented panel of experts which will provide a comprehensive overview of the current maritime landscape with a focus on opportunities for business and industry trends. Please note that throughout the forum, you will be able to pose your questions through the conference site, which you can scan on your badges. So let's welcome on stage Mrs. Carleen Lyden Walker, Chief Evolution Officer, IMO Goodwill Maritime Ambassador, SHIPPINGInsight. Mr. Robert Walker, CEO and Founder, Surveys and Forecasts. Mr. Erik Holmgren, Economic Office of the US Embassy to Greece. Mr. Richard Paul, Investor and Shareholder of SHIPGLIDE. And the moderator and great friend, Mrs. Dorothea Ioannou, CEO of the American P&I Club.
Thank you. First, I want to just say once again how privileged I feel to be a part of this conference. I think I've been probably participating for over 12 years now. I don't remember ever since we met. And I have to say that every single year, it just gets absolutely better and better. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is that, Christina, you said something about a comprehensive overview. I'm not really sure we can do comprehensive in 45 minutes, but we will do our absolute very best. I'm very excited because we have an excellent panel here. Yes, there is a sort of a US theme going on with my colleagues here. I'm very excited about the topic because when you talk about current trends and opportunities, I don't think that there's a topic that we can't put in it, right? I don't think that there has been a series of years, let's say, in recent history that has been riddled by more disruption than probably the last 4 or 5 years. Having said that, we're really only going to touch on the surface, I think. And please do feel free to put your questions in. We will try at the end. Like I said, it's not a lot of time, so we're just going to go into it. I know we said we were going to have each of you kind of introduce yourselves, but I think Christina kind of did that. And if there's anything else you want to say, you can say it as we go through the discussion, if that's okay with everybody. Okay, so let's just let's jump into this. Actually, one more thing I wanted to say, but he's gone. Ambassador Tsounis, actually, for me, it's such a wonderful thing to hear somebody talk about love, not just inclusion. It's something that I talk about a lot within my organization, and sometimes it makes people uncomfortable, but it shouldn't. So I'm really, really happy that he threw that word out there. Okay, let's begin with Rob, okay? Your business is one that focuses on market forces and generally affected by consumer attitudes. It's kind of a foreign concept, I think, within the maritime industry. It's probably something that we haven't really spoken about a lot, except if you look at the cruise industry and the container industry. So, should it be? Why should traditional shipping sector players really care about the consumer when planning strategy?
Good morning. Kalimera. I first have to acknowledge Ambassador Tsounis because his personal story actually touches a little bit on my personal story. My Armenian grandmother was sheltered in Piraeus back in 1915 and made her way to Patras through the help of the Greek people. And for that I am forever grateful. She emigrated to the United States through Ellis Island, and that's why I am here. So I'm very grateful to Greece and to the families that helped her on her journey. So, why is the consumer and what the consumer thinks and feels, their attitudes and behaviors important for maritime and in particular for shipping? If you think about it from a fairly high-level point of view, all demand is consumer demand. If we set aside military and other sorts of needs, if you boil it right down to its most fundamental, elemental aspect, all demand is consumer demand. So the question now becomes, how does that affect your strategic view of your business? And the key word here is strategic. So I want you to think not necessarily this quarter, next quarter, even next year, but where will shipping need to be 40, 50, 60 years from now, and where will that demand come from? And I can tell you right now, if you look at the demographic trends in particular, but also the attitudinal and behavioral shifts that we're seeing more in the developed world than in the non-developed world, but it's happening around the world. The population trends that Ambassador Souness was talking about, the local level population shifts in developed worlds, the population is declining. It's declining in major markets around the world. If you look at major markets like the United States, it's flat to slightly increasing, but in mostly due to immigration, I might add. But if you look at a country like China, Russia, Japan, the population is declining at a fairly rapid rate, and 25 to 50 years from now, it'll be minus 25%, and in 50 years, 50 to 100 years, it'll be minus almost 50%. So we're looking at countries that are going to lose tremendous amounts of population, and that's going to affect the demand component of the consumer question. But the other part, aside from the demand, is also going to be in terms of how attitudes are changing and how those attitudes are shifting in terms of the sources of supply, the types of products that are being requested. Are they sustainable? Are you delivering products that are in packaging that is recyclable, that is reusable? If you've got large population groups that are flat or declining, what does that do to consumption? Consumption is going to be potentially flat or declining. Where is the volume going to be? What will that volume look like? And if you're a fan of Malcolm Gladwell, one of his famous books is called The Tipping Point. We are at a tipping point in terms of population change, in terms of where attitudes are going. Consumers want to do the right thing. Shipping has an opportunity to be in the lead in demonstrating how that can happen. So for example, if you look at a company like Amazon, where they're chartering their own ships, yes, they're doing that for logistical flexibility, for cost control, but they're also approximately much closer to the demand. They see where the retail consumer is shopping, what they're buying, the size, the quantity, the SKUs. They can anticipate the capacity needs that their ultimate consumer is going to require, and shipping is responding to that by being more flexible, more capable, and being able to deliver those goods on time in a manner that the end consumer wants. So I hope that
No, definitely. I think at a high level definitely gives us that insight that we were looking for.
Yes.
Carleen, we've seen, as I said before, the last few years riddled with probably the most disruption that we've seen in recent history. And we've seen also, actually, interestingly, how these kinds of factors can possibly change priorities and international norms. This topic, of course, is huge, but can you tell us a little bit about how these factors may impact relating to maritime security? So, for example, the interplay between energy security versus environmental targets.
Thank you, Dorothea. But I want to start by thanking Denai for inviting me today, but you lied to me. You said this was going to be English proceedings, and I didn't understand half of the jokes that the ambassador said. So I have a problem with that. And it's also, I have to say, Captain Paniotis, it is such an honor to see you again. Captain Paniotis was so graceful, hospitable, and kind to me from the very beginning of my career. So thank you, Captain. A lot of people ask me, how did you get into shipping? Well, I grew up on an island south of Detroit, where the Detroit River and Lake Erie meet. And when I was a little girl, the Detroit River was the second busiest waterway after the Suez Canal. Not as much tonnage as out here, but still an active waterway, and that's where my fascination began. We now own a home in Greece, in Kassos, so I went from one island to another. At any rate, thank you again, Denai, for including us. You know, as Rob mentioned, the public, the consumer, is taking a keen interest on the impact its habits are having on our planet. And that involves looking at an industry that they normally don't pay attention to unless there's a, container ship stuck in the Suez Canal. But I flew Delta coming over here. And I'm a movie watcher. Delta's commercial was on sustainability. And if I didn't like the movie, I'd switch to another movie. I saw that commercial on sustainability multiple times with their commitment to net zero by 2050. I also can't tell you how excited I was when I saw Apple's sustainability video. How many of you have seen Apple's sustainability video? Oh my gosh, it is so fabulous. Tim Cook stares down Mother Nature, played by Octavia Spencer. But most importantly, one of the biggest points they made in terms of their sustainability was that they were saving 99% of their emissions by sending their goods on ships rather than by air. We need to get that message out. More ships, more ships, more ships. That also gives us the responsibility to look at how we're managing those ships. The recent events in Ukraine and the Persian Gulf illuminate the need for energy security. The ban on Russian oil and gas only forced the EU to pivot away from Russian resources. But it also spawned a subsector of our industry we call the dark fleet. Illegal shipments of sanctioned Russian oil threatens the environment, as many of those ships are old and poorly maintained. We can only hope that an environmental disaster is not created by greed. We also have to look at the disruption in fuels, from methanol to ammonia to hydrogen and nuclear. Yes, I said nuclear. The small nuclear reactors that are safer and have less waste. Watch this space, because there is a real application in the maritime industry for nuclear, not just for propulsion, but for power generation. Another aspect of disruption and change is digitalization. We need to focus not just on the efficiencies we gain in digitalization in our operations and our everyday lives, but also the risks and the vulnerabilities of cyber. And this is near and dear to Dorothea's heart, I know. We have to look at the sensors on our ships and the programs we run in our offices to protect against the vulnerability of malware or other bad actors trying to get into our systems. And when we talk about this, we're not talking about an inconvenience. We're talking about millions of dollars at stake. And we've seen examples of that. And apparently shipping is the most highly targeted industry for cyber attacks. The other piece about that is that I have this nightmare. It's an Alfred Hitchcock type movie where there's a tanker sailing into New York Harbor and it's overtaken by bad actors and it sails into Battery Park and gives a whole new meaning to I'll Take Manhattan. So those are some of the issues and the disruptors and the change that we as an industry need to look at and move forward with.
Thank you, Carleen. Richard, let's move to one of the most talked about topics in the industry. Not one conference, I think, takes place anymore without talking about the green transition, and rightfully so, and everything that comes with it. It's a dynamic subject. I think that we're all familiar with the IMO and other authorities' targets, and I know that with your background, what's your take on feasibility, and what are some of your thoughts on how we can get there?
Well, first I'd like to thank Denai, wherever she may be, for the love that she gave everybody to show up at this program. And I did not realize that, the indoor and plumbing, and we have about as much time to talk as we have to use the plumbing, so I appreciate all this. So basically, I'll turn my timer on so I can adhere to your requirements here.
We are totally on time so far. Yeah.
Okay. It's Greece. Time is flexible in Greece. Well, that's good to know. That's good to know. So basically, this is probably one of the toughest questions on the planet, and we all realize that. And I've got involved in the shipping industry very, very recently. I've put millions of dollars behind a particular air lubrication system, and I believe that we're on a very good track. And some of the things that I have realized while I'm preparing the hardest question on the planet that somebody gave me is basically the fact that carbon capture is probably one of the biggest things that we should be looking at, and putting that to where you have your 17 refineries around here. And I am suggesting that the gross national products from each country start looking at investing in these type of technology as percentage of the gross national product. I've also, thought a little bit about, and we're starting to, think in a little bit more detail, is about the green bonds that are out there that are underwritten by the World Bank through the International Monetary Fund, and how important that is for having money out there that's basically AAA, and that other investors can invest in and help these technologies go forward. And ironically, as everybody has read recently, Emirates have launched $750 billion for a 5-year debut of green bonds. I find that very interesting, with 40% going outside of their country. And under the leadership that we have here of His Royal Highness Mohammed Solomon, who has basically led the way here, these countries are looking at oil and how do they transition from oil. And, personally, I think it's unrealistic to believe that by 2050 we're going to be carbon net zero. I think that that's really an impossibility. You have a lot of nations that depend on oil. 90% of their income comes from oil. And if basically you decide to pull all the oil away, the world instability that we've already seen, whether it's Venezuela, Iraq, or, certainly some bad actors like Iran and so forth. And so as you start putting these pieces together, we have to have a comprehensive way to get there. And as you have carbon capture at $17 a metric ton, it needs to move closer to $100 a ton. And the only way that could happen is if countries get together, and let's say that becomes a priority of various countries. And that's what I've started to focus on a little bit. I think nuclear is a great answer. The young people have to start looking at changing this.
Mindset.
When I grew up, we had all the protests against nuclear energy because of 3 Mile Island and everything else. It gives you a little bit of a taste of my age. But, in our company, which is SHIPGLIDE, we have most of our people are under the age of 30. We have women, and we have a couple of women sitting over there, and we're supporting women in shipping, and everything that we saw was missing in the industry. And I'm reminded by most women that they're smarter than men. So, we can agree with that in some ways. And as I've gone through this metrics, and I've started looking at, everything that has gone on, and the regulation is going to come into play, no doubt about it. We know that under the CII, that the ships are graded in terms of, their grading, and what they do is slow down. They take a different route, they get to port, and they circle around. Slowing down to 10% or 10 knots or lower for a lot of the vessels means there's more vessels on the ocean, which means more pollution that will happen. And we have to be practical about this. And I guess will be a question later more about some of the things that we're involved in doing. But kind of what happened to me is about 7 years ago, they thought I had stage 4 cancer, and I didn't. I had an operation, and, luckily I was not sick. And so I said, how, you say to God, how in the world can I make the world a better place than I found it? And so I've dedicated, I've been very successful, luckily. I've dedicated my fortune to invest in companies that do this. We're planting 1 million trees in Ukraine as part of the Peace Force as they remove landmines. And that came from, our board of advisors, Tom Ridge, Ridge Global, and Thanos is over there if you have a chance to meet him. And so these collaborations are good. Alexander Zanner, we meet in Brussels here on Saturday. And unfortunately, we fly a private jet, so our carbon footprint's a little bit higher. But, he has 1 billion trees from the Mongolian government that's been committed. And there's 200 million that he is looking at. The problem that they have is under the United Nations, as everybody knows, there's a lot of fraud in trees. Are they really doing as well as they say they are? Also, when you're planting farmland for trees, and you're having deforestation in other areas for crops. So it's a very complicated worldwide problem. And I think the shipping industry has a unique place in history here, because as you start, monitoring the ships correctly, and Joe Inzerella's on my advisory board. He's going to be on the board. He was the back end of Disney streaming. He works for Cirrus now. They throw satellites up, and we're meeting with people like Kimball Musk and Sergey, who's one of the founders of Google's, and we're having a get together. It's the first Earth One summit with 6 billionaires, and these are the conversation that we're having. And having our particular system is going to go on a stealth system that they're trying to get a battery-powered ship to cross the ocean. Well, that takes really great technology. You don't have the infrastructure in these countries to do that, and a lot of that's a pipe dream. But we're developing. We have a laboratory that I bought as part of this, so we just do testing constantly on different systems. What's their drag on the system? How does it work? What are the real numbers? And the shipping industry, unfortunately, will err on the side of higher numbers versus true numbers, because that helps with their rating and everything else. And eventually, the IMO and others will catch up with the technology, and then it'll be a problem. So getting it right is more important. I think that the shipping industry needs to have a carrot instead of the stick. I was a developer for most of my life. I actually own a lot of apartments, more than 2 million some odd square feet of apartments. But I learned that going through this process is the government overregulates to try to get people to change. Money makes the difference. So the shipping industry can save money on fuel and technology. It's basically a ratio. The CO2 emissions go down. And so why not give carbon credits a higher number than 17 a ton, which means you cannot afford carbon capture? Why not work together as nations, like the U.S. Treasury bonds that you sell or whatever, and let's raise the value of the carbon credits. You're trying to get mandatory $100 a ton. Well, that's going to take shipping industry out of business. When you had to do the scrubbers, some bankruptcies happened because if you had 50 ships, $1 million per scrubber, that's $50 million out the door. And so there are ways with green bonds to help the industry, and there are ways to do this. And so I guess I went over because I can tell where we got this going on.
It's okay.
So anyway, we're passionate about it. We have a passionate team, and the younger people are passionate about things. And I actually think you'll have some success over time, with the nuclear, which is a great option.
I think we have to explore every single avenue, right? Erik, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. I'm going to go to a different kind of trend, different type of topic. As I don't know if many of you realize this, but there was a point in time where the United States was the maritime leader in the world. It was about a century ago, and probably for about 20 years. And that was actually when the American Club was born. Makes sense. So, there are many factors that have led to the state of the American maritime industry the way it is today. But the U.S. government has actually very recently recognized the issue as one of national critical importance. Erik, can you just give us some insight on what we're doing about that?
Thanks for the question. It's a great one because it's so hard to answer. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you much insight on it, but it's an issue that we deal with at the embassy every day. Reliable providers of shipping. Our United States approach has been a free market approach, and as you said, this is not something that happened overnight. It's been a 100-year process. It's not going to be fixed overnight. And the lack of capacity in the U.S. shipping industry is also just a part of a realization that we have to protect ourselves as Americans from unreliable partners as far as ones that are in the global economy but don't necessarily play by the rules. We saw the Bipartisan Build Act, which is designed to sort of address some of these strategic vulnerabilities. So yeah, the U.S. is aware that this is a problem. There's been the need to recapitalize and modernize. The U.S. Navy has a program now to buy vessels to try to ameliorate this risk, but it is a risk. There's a realization that it's not just an economic issue, it's a national security issue, and it's not just a national security issue for America, but for all our partners. The ambassador, I hear a lot of his speeches. One of his common themes, though, is partnership and the importance of that. Greece is obviously a great partner. So one of the things we're doing policy-wise is to try to work with like-minded partners, whether it's through the G7, the UN, IMO, EU, to try to build some sort of consensus and a rules-based way to deal with global problems. It's a work in progress, and again, one of the things is to try as policymakers, and I think we'll speak about Russian sanctions a little bit, is to try to make sure that the cost of not being part of the rules-based organization is more than being part of it. That's a really hard thing to do, and it takes a lot of work, and it's something that we frankly hadn't necessarily focused on as much as we should have. I think the other thing I'll flag, and the ambassador flagged it as well, is when we talk about building up a U.S. fleet or like-minded fleet, what do we want that fleet to look like? We don't want to build up our fleet with the lowest common denominator. So a modern fleet that's energy efficient, that is green. We've got a Green Shipping Challenge, which the United States and Norway have put forward. The ambassador also flagged our oceans. These events are very important to bring all stakeholders together. And one of the things too that we're trying to do at the embassy is broaden the voices. Our oceans is an interesting forum that hasn't necessarily brought in the shipping industry, but it should. So we get everybody at the table to try to form some sort of consensus to deal with these challenges that again didn't happen overnight. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Erik. So collaboration really is probably a major part of that. Going back to you, Carleen, staying on maritime security. Maritime security most of the time makes us think of things like defense issues, some of the issues that Erik talked about. But let's talk about maybe resources, and one of the most valuable resource is the human resource and the role of workforce development within this context. Can you give us some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly can, but I want to go back a little bit to what Erik said, because I can say things that Erik can't say, because I'm a civilian, and what I have to say is not government-based. But getting back to national security, to put what
Be careful you don't say anything Erik doesn't want you to say.
Yeah, well, I've tried to clear it. Erik alluded. Erik alluded to the fact that the U.S. sea lift capacity is minimal. Is that politically correct? Can I say that? Okay. We don't have a robust international fleet for sea lift purposes. For instance, the United States now has 10 tankers. MARAD has their tanker security program, all 10 tankers. Yay. And it's considered a great accomplishment. But just to counter that, I was invited last March to NATO's Allied Maritime Command to discuss maritime security and to brief their new admiral on maritime security. And it was quite an honor to do that. And one of the recommendations that I made was developing a NATO security force, a NATO support force, so that the resources of all the NATO countries can come together in an organized fashion and be in a coordinated fashion. And as part of that, I don't know whether it was anything I said in March, but last week at the National Defense Transportation Association, there was a NATO representative there talking about coordinating logistics. So maybe the conversation is beginning. But further, I'm working on 2 initiatives to develop mechanisms to support our sea lift requirements and obtain needed tonnage to face any adversary. One of the approaches we call our break glass in case of emergency tool. It's a mechanism where in an event there might be something that might happen somewhere on a large scale far away from the United States, that we can marshal the resources that we need to support our military and provide sea lift capability. And the other is a discussion of a second U.S. registry that I'm working on. We're going to have to call it something like an economic security program, because anytime you mention second register in the United States, the unions go ballistic. And they'd rather preserve a very small industry and keep it small than recognize the risks to the United States. I'm sorry, I'm saying things you can't say, so there we go. But setting steel aside, there is currently a 5,000 mariner shortfall in the United States. And a recent Transportation Institute report said that 20 to 25% of all U.S. sailings right now are sailing under U.S. Coast Guard waivers because of lack of full crew complement. All branches of the United States military, with the exception of the Marines, are experiencing shortages. The Coast Guard has a 3,500 mariner shortfall, which has caused the Coast Guard Commandant to reduce her cutter fleet. By the way, I said her cutter fleet. Also, the Navy did not reach their recruitment goals for 2023 by 7,000 recruits. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to visit Helmepa, and I can't tell you how exciting it was to see their bridge simulator, because they bring students in all the time, and we need to find these opportunities to bring more people into our industry. But we have a people shortage, not just in recruiting, but also in retaining. Last Sunday, I visited the Totoy Airfield Air Force Museum, and it was fabulous. It was so exciting to see. But they have 2 simulators there, and there were kids lining up to use the simulators, and they each got their certificates at the end of the simulator experience. How fabulous is that? We've got a lot of future pilots coming forward here in Greece. But I also learned that in the recent officer recruitment corps, if you will, of 40, 7 of them resigned because they were told their cell phones would be taken away from them for 40 days. On the flip, and that just demonstrates the relationship between individuals and their mobile phones. On the flip side, I was very excited to learn that the incoming class of non-commissioned officers is 50% female. And women aren't required to do military service in Greece, so that was extremely exciting. But I want to, again, affirm what Captain Spanos said. We have to recruit, do a better job as an industry to promote awareness about our value proposition in order to bring more people in, to educate them about the excellent jobs that we offer. It's anticipated that globally we're going to be short 90,000 mariners by 2026. And let's not ignore the 50% of our potential workforce, women. Because with the automation, with the advances in technology, there's no physical requirement for maritime anymore, either afloat or ashore. But when we get them in our industry, we need to provide not only adequate training and wages, but also a quality of life that has not existed in past times. And while I'm not endorsing creating a generation of what I call special snowflakes, I do believe we have to take into consideration the humanitarian needs and aspects that we would expect on shore to receive. So connectivity is ground zero and expected. With services like Starlink, it's affordable and easily accessible because connectivity matters to mariners. Healthy food, access to exercise, feeling they matter and that they have purpose is also important, along with health and mental health awareness and support. So Gee, we don't have too much
Very
to do,
simple.
do we?
Very simple. Thank you, Carleen. I'm going to flip around the order here. I'm going to go back to Erik. And I want to talk a little bit about, the crazy topic of geopolitics. The United States traditionally, usually, is one of the main drivers. They weren't the original drivers, but they have traditionally been the main drivers. But now that's being matched by the EU and the UK in this arena. And can you just explain a little bit about the rationale behind the use of sanctions and the view of government when evaluating it in terms of its impact on trade?
Thank you. Another simple question.
Very easy.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just for historical purposes, when we were looking to impose sanctions on Russia due to its invasion and occupation of Ukraine, we had a team come out, then Ambassador O'Brien, who was the head of our sanctions office, and some other high-level officials to speak to the Greek government and some people in this room even about crafting a sanctions regime that made sense. And making sure that when we as policymakers were going to do something that affects an industry, and an industry in this country which is gigantic, that we were doing it the right way and we were getting their input. So I just want to thank folks involved in the shipping industry for providing us some insights to help hone our sanctions policy, and we continue to have those discussions. We wanted to impose a cost on Russia for invading a sovereign country. And, the ambassador touched on this, and I don't think I need to sort of repeat that position. EU and a number of other countries are like-minded in that goal. The easiest way to lose support for a sanctions regime is to cripple your own economies through that sanction. So it's a really hard problem to solve. Making sure Russian oil gets to market, but at a reduced price. We've had some success. There's a lot of critics of the sanctions regime on sort of both sides. Again, I want to thank the Greek shipping industry for being leaders in compliance. They made a point to us very early is that the Greek shipping industry cannot be the people who are enforcing sanctions. Like, they can't be the ones who are evaluating cargoes.
Neither can the insurance companies.
Yeah, the insurance companies, yeah. And so we took that to heart. And so, if people would, including myself, who served in Russia and was actually kicked out of Russia, would like to see a harsher cost imposed on Russia. But, at the end of the day, it's important to maintain, reliable, safe shipping. And that leads us to another, and I touched upon this, is how do you get more people involved in this? And we had a discussion yesterday with some colleagues in the State Department. And one of the things we haven't probably done so well is to have people who are not necessarily inclined to join the sanctions regime against Russia understand there's other costs. It's not just about punishing Russia, but when you have these shadow fleets or dark fleets or whatever you want to call it, they're using ships that are not safe. They are not insured. And what happens if there's an environmental disaster? Who pays for that cleanup? To try to get some other countries to start thinking about it in a different way, and understand that there are, and you might get oil at a cheaper price, but there's other risks involved with it.
Putting their coastlines at risk.
Exactly. Right? And so we're looking and we're talking with the EU and again the whole like-minded partners to start figuring out ways to maybe have countries that are not complying with this think about it in a different way and think about how it's they're taking risks by not being part of the regime. And again, coming back to the idea, make it more costly for people to be outside of the sanctions regime than inside of the sanctions regime. So again, that's sort of the quick answer. If it were easy, we would have had it solved by now.
Debated,
yeah, we would have had it solved by now. But again, it's an ongoing sort of discussion.
Thank you, Erik. Richard, putting aside the targets and how we're going to meet these long term, can you give us some insight on some of the things that you're working on that offer energy savings now, today?
Well, we're so basically this company that I took over. I own 63% of it, and we're financed at what used to be called SHIPGLIDE, and John Dixon, who was the founder of it, he was, and maybe some of you know him from the BLT lab that he has in Florida that we own now as well. And basically through that mechanism we were able to study, he did for the last decade, and basically in being engineers and being around some of the best engineers and scientists of the day, they do a lot of analytical analysis and they don't do a lot of implementation of it, which is pretty typical for engineers, right? And so when we got involved in it, we just immediately realized the potential, and the patent pendings that we have are amazing. And as they were, pitching me and we're studying these things in the lab, we realized that there are systems out there that weren't studied necessarily in a lab, and they're trying to put, air lubrication in the boundary layer, but they have too much air, they're in the wrong location. Or they basically have the equivalence because it's like a cheese grater that's out there of having 12 nozzles on the ship. Well, they have to be turned off at certain times. There's requirements, as people know in the cruise industry. We have, Jamie over there who worked for Royal Caribbean for a long time, and he is with us, and he's done hundreds of millions of dollars in installations throughout the world. And so basically we get through that process where we learn that they have to turn, for the cruise industry, at certain times they turn the system off for maybe as much as 8 to 10 hours, Jamie could correct me. And so actually some of these systems have basically a negative coefficient when you really look at it. And so we said, this is a problem that can be solved. And in the lab we're basically have been able to produce greater than we have on this piece of paper here, but that's the future 3.0. So we're at 2.0 technology with no drag underneath the ship, which is fantastic because it can be turned off during noises for the crews or the passengers, and where you locate the generators and things of that nature. And so we're very enthusiastic, and part of the challenge for us is the number of people that have come to be on our books, and making sure that we can deliver all this within 7 days, which is critical for when you're in the dry dock, that we can do these things. We can do, like we're talking to the Navy, you can obviously do, cofferdams and things of that nature to install outside. But we're very, very enthusiastic about it, and we're lucky that we've teamed up with a lot of highly educated people. I've been involved in similar spaces before. I've been involved with startup companies, and most of them don't tend to work. But this is pretty good engineering. And you have speed through the water, you have speed over land, and of course, if I could talk too long, I noticed before that
It's okay.
I went
Thank
over,
you.
and we also have got lunch coming up. And I learned one thing: when you speak to groups of people, you don't leave them hungry.
Keep them hanging too long.
Yeah. Oh, you wanted to add to it? Oh, okay. Well, and so we're starting to look at different things, and like I had mentioned earlier, and the boundary layer technology and how you keep it in the boundary layer is critical, and your sea states are critical. And then how do you identify this? And then, working with Joe Inzarello and things of that nature. And we're going to be able to, as these things develop, we're going to be able to actually be more true and be able to recommend as you go through your headings to say, through various other ships to say, this is not the heading that you want to be on at this particular time. You can save more fuel.
Just.
And then, and at the port, when you're delivered on the port, you can have direct communication. Some of that's going on today with Napa, but there's other things that are going to be happening. So we're
Exciting times.
Very, very enthusiastic.
Yes.
Now I'm being cut off, right?
Exciting
times.
Exciting times, for
No,
sure.
thank
Thank you for that. I think we have about 5 minutes left on our panel, right? Final thoughts. Let's go back to Rob. Talking about disruption, where do you think disruption is going to come from next?
Well, predictions about the future are always dangerous, so I won't make any. But I will say that disruption happens slowly, incrementally, and then suddenly is typically what we have seen over the course of history. So what's happening slowly and incrementally? Consumer attitudes are changing about sustainability, caring for the environment. Erik was talking about the hidden costs of a maritime accident. The Gen Zers and the millennials care about the total cost. We see that in survey research, we see that in attitudinal research, we see that in lots of other types of data. And there are now smartphone apps that are being developed, I know, because I'm working on with the team on one of them, which will allow consumers to evaluate the sustainability profile of different products. And shipping has a huge potential role in that equation, because if a consumer knows that the products, the goods were transported by an environmentally responsible shipping company, and that shipping company is known to the consumer through their public relations or advertising efforts, and I'm not just talking about the cruise industry or Apple, I'm talking about maritime shipping. If the stature of the industry is raised to the point where consumers have some level of awareness and understand that you're doing all the right things to make sure that goods are being transported in an efficient, environmentally responsible way, consumers are going to respond to that. They're already responding to that. We see it in all of their behavior. So we also see some, we'll call it hypocritical behavior. They're still going to Starbucks, but they're still looking for the opportunity to be good environmental stewards. Let's give them a reason to be good environmental stewards. Shipping can do those things. I think if the message gets out, and the message is positive, there are lots of positive things that can happen just in that one area alone. On the major disruptive side, it's all demographics. Demographics are flat in the developing world or declining in terms of population, birth rate. If you look to where the population is growing most rapidly, all you have to look for is a map of Africa. You look to Nigeria, you look to the Democratic Republic of Congo. The population there is doubling every 25 years. In 2050 to 2075, Nigeria will be the third most populated country on the planet, after India and China. The top 10 most populated countries by 2075, 5 of them will be in Africa. That's where the disruption is going to come next. That's where the demand will come from next. Denai showed a great video at the beginning with all of the disruption in the world. Progress is not a straight line. It never is, and it never will be. But if you follow where population is going and what that trajectory looks like, that's where the business will be. So if shipping can be there in advance of where that is going, it stands a wonderful chance of remaining prosperous for the next 200, 500 years.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was actually very, a little bit eye-opening. I'm not seeing any questions here on the app, unless I'm not looking at it correctly. Okay. So I guess we hit it all on the nail here, and nobody has any further questions.
I just want to say one thing to the conversation about disruption. The disruption of the today is the norm of their careers. You're going to be implementing all the what we're calling disruption is going to be your norm. So exercise your voice on what you want this industry to look at. And I'm pointing to the cadets over here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Carleen. So thank you. I hope that you found this as enlightening as I did. Καλή συνέχεια.
Before going to the second panel, I can do this before taking the photo. I would like to thank Dorothea. She's a long-term friend, almost a sister, and I want to tell you that last week she was also got an award as the WISTA International Personality, that for first time 3 WISTA USA, WISTA Hellas, Greece, and WISTA Cyprus proposed one person, and she got it, and this is also great for our country, for Greece. So congrats, and we're very happy to have you with us.